Great. Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us and coming back in to listen to this panel. And we are going to be following up on some of the conversations we've already had today, but talking specifically about energy infrastructure, trade, and industrial policy, and where these all meet. And as you've heard a little bit so far, I think one of the single biggest shifts of this last decade has been the return and the rise of industrial policy in country after country. And one of the areas of highest priority, of the most activity, dare I say the most ambition, has been the energy sector for so many of these industrial policies. And so, governments are making big bets. They're putting out lots of legislation or lots of different policies to try to hurry the energy transition, rightly addressing some of the market failures there and sort of the speed of adaptation of renewables and the like. But governments have lots of other priorities when they're putting these policies in place, right? They're thinking about national security issues and sort of the great power competition return and how the dependence they have vis-a-vis geopolitical rivals. They're thinking about economic competition and who's going to lead the various technological races, who's going to come out on top in those spaces. And some countries are thinking about economic development and diversification. Those nations that didn't do as well in the globalization of the last 40 years, they think perhaps this green transition is a way for them to get back in the game and to grow their economies and to prosper more broadly. So there's lots of goals out there. And we're going to talk a little bit about what they are, if they're succeeding, and where it's going to leave us in terms of global energy infrastructure today. So, Sarah, let me start with you. And let me ask you to talk a bit about, as your take on, especially U.S. policy, these competing goals. Where is the U.S.? I mean, some of these goals are in line with each other. Some are actually counterproductive or very different in sort of balancing. So as you look at the policies of this last 3 or 4 years in the energy space, what have been the priorities here? How are they balancing these competing goals?
Oh, well, thanks. And first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm honored to be a visiting fellow at the Columbia Energy effort. Really something I wanted to be part of, just all the great work that is going on here. So thanks for having me. I think that the United States government is really learning as it goes. When the Inflation Reduction Act passed, obviously showing such an important priority to fund and help fund the energy transition, there was a lot of feedback from allies and close United States partners. And there were some issues that we worked actually very hard in the Biden administration to try and resolve. So issues with Korea, who had just built a plant in Georgia, but wouldn't be up and running in time, and issues with Japan and others. And so there's a lot of things, I think, as you kind of go back to industrial policy that you have to kind of work through in the global economy. And I think those conversations have been iterative, but I think directionally, we are coming to a bit of a more common understanding with allies, and certainly there's been a lot of investment from allies in the United States. I would say with regard to China, it's been way more complicated. There are a lot of provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act very much limiting foreign entities of concern. So you see that playing out in the EV space, in the mineral space, and I think, as Jason talked about earlier, with connected vehicles and a lot of concerns about that, I think those tensions are going to continue, and that we're going to continue to see, eruptions on occasion when, a member of Congress realizes that it's a Chinese solar plant or whatever that's getting 45x tax credit. So I think, a long way to go. We're in the early innings of this, but, very much bifurcated in terms of how it's playing out, whether it's China versus other nations.
Let me ask you, because there's lots of technologies here, right? There's solar, there's wind, there's green hydrogen, electrolyzers. There's all these different areas, and we have these different. And we just heard from John Podesta. There's this sense of urgency that we need to deploy as fast as possible. But there was also a sense that we also need to protect ourselves from China, to not put too fine a point on it. So as you think about this balance between national security and making in rapid deployment, are there particular technologies where it makes sense to lean one way or the other? As you think about how would you go about this, where would you lean into one side and where would you lean to the other side of these many goals?
No, that's a great question. Look, and each of these technologies are sort of on their own trajectory, really, with their own set of incentives. The industries, as we found them, are differently positioned, right? So there's parts of the clean energy market, whether it's critical minerals, that's very China dependent. I think the administration was right to think carefully about the connected car. So whether the imports of that, because there is a lot of data from some of these cars. I would say, if I were in charge of the world, the Inflation Reduction Act itself, there's a lot of constraints around the consumer credit to buy these cars and where the minerals come from and the 30D provisions. So, probably a little tight there. And on the 45X, the manufacturing of some of these industries, maybe they could have tightened a little there. So it's a bit uneven, but I do think how you think about the final vehicle is probably in the EV space is one that I think is right to worry about from a national security perspective.
What would you do with solar panels? Because we just should let it go because now we're making fences in Europe with solar panels. The prices are so low. Or, Europe, Australia, others are trying to bring that industry back. Would you do the same here in the U.S.?
Well, I think what the administration did was directionally correct in the sense of giving a pause on some of the tariffs and getting deployment going here. But now the domestic industry has had some time, and so my assumption is that the Biden administration will let the tariffs come back in June, and I think that's was probably the right balance. Certainly, didn't make everybody happy. None of these things ever did, but there are places where the United States industry just wasn't, advanced enough, and so you did need to give time, and there were concerns. But I think all of these, again, they're all sort of on different paths, depending on the state of each industry, and I think there will need to be a lot of additional policies as we go forward and we see how the process unfolds.
Matt, let me turn to you because, all these policies you were putting in place and there's lots of investment being made there, but, the trillions of dollars that are needed to make this transition to invest in energy infrastructure aren't going to come from governments and taxes in the end, right? It's going to come from the private sector. And talk a little bit about, if you would, how policies are influencing the investment decisions that you're making. Are these really making a difference in nudging you? And if so, in what sort of directions?
Sure. So thank you, by the way, Shannon. And it's great to be here amongst all of you, such a great convening. So I think as we think about the scale of energy transition and decarbonization, maybe just to put it into a reference frame, somebody showed me a great chart last week of the 5 sort of central investment super cycles of the last 150 years, starting with electrification, industrialization, globalization, digitalization, and now energy transition. So the estimates are varied, but something like $100 trillion of investment over the next 25 years in order to decarbonize, much of that being in infrastructure. I think your point is right on. There is no way that governments are able to do that either from a funding perspective or from a knowledge and know-how perspective. There are, in many cases, already investable sectors and subsectors in the energy transition that can be done without policy, without incentives. Renewables are an example. Now, we still have renewables incentives, but when we look at a deal at GIP, we don't assume any incentives that are necessary to make the math work. Other industries are different, and that's going to be the case for quite a period of time because the cost of carbon abatement in many of these sectors and subsectors is well above what it would be for a traditional fossil fuel solution. So when I think about policy and I would think about how can government and the private sector work together, because that's really what's necessary. Deficits matter, funding matters. I think about three things. One is a softer thing, and I think about it as accountability and convening, right? It is bringing together parties in some sort of way that will allow investment to occur and allow the parties to have a bilateral conversation about what's necessary. The second is economic, and that can be incentives, that can be policy-driven, rebates, grant programs. I was out visiting a company that is building a high-speed electric rail, the first one in the United States. It'll go from Las Vegas to Los Angeles at 200 plus miles an hour. They got a $3 billion grant from the Department of Transportation, and Secretary Pete is going out for the groundbreaking. That's how significant it is, $3 billion as a grant. So economic incentives are critical. And then the last is what I would think of as legal transparency, regulation. I mean, think about the United States as a perfect example from a transmission perspective. We haven't solved the conundrum of state-level regulation for electricity transmission. And that is going to have to be solved in order to be able to even think about meeting all the demand we have. And this is before the advent of AI and data centers.
Let me ask you, that makes a lot of sense, and we have sort of these direct subsidies in the IRA, that $3 billion, you have the regulations here in the US. Let me ask you a bit about, because I know you participated in some of these with the US government. I mean, one of the areas, there's these direct, effects, and then there's some of these other types of frameworks that have been developed. So there's the, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, there's America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APEP, there's the, Trade and Technology Council, TTC, with Europe. And these are frameworks. Often they have an energy pillar. They have supply chain pillars. How much do these matter? The critics would say these are really photo ops and there's not a lot there. There's nothing, mandatory. There's not side. But do these matter for the investment environment as you think about this around the world?
They do matter, but my issue heretofore with them has been the lack of really significant private market participants at the table. And so you generally have a government-sponsored initiative with an array of multilaterals, development banks, and governments trying to work the issues. So I went last summer to Secretary Raimondo, and I said, the IPEF, I think, is amazing, and it's doing incredible things, and she's an incredible force. I said, what's missing is GIP and KKR and Brookfield and anybody else that has a major place at the table in terms of infrastructure expertise. And if you're a government in Vietnam or Malaysia or wherever, you need access to that level of information. If you look, for instance, at the airport sector in Asia, what you'll find is a significant historical investment in infrastructure that's been made. They have, if you went to Kuala Lumpur, you'd find a massive airport. The same in the Philippines. What you'll see missing is a lack of understanding of a commercial framework that needs to get applied to that, how it can be justified in the context of the trade and tourism flow that particular country has. And without people who have experience in that, investing in that, they're not going to be able to figure that out. So I said, let's form a partnership, which we're now on the verge of forming with GIP, BlackRock, KKR, CGEP, BCG, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And the first piece of that will be, let's help the countries in question identify, organize, and prioritize what the opportunity set is. And let us bring our expertise to that to help identify what's already financeable and then what is going to be financeable in the future and what might need those incentives or policy directives to do it.
Luis Alberto, let me bring you in actually on this sort of last point in the opportunities, and especially in turning from the U.S. and advanced industrial economies to, the global South, quote unquote. And, here, this is where climate change or the heating of the world will be slowed or not in the global South. And it's also a place where there are a lot of opportunities and I think a lot of ambitions for many countries to use this moment of green transition to power their own economies and to sort of grow and see prosperity. And so, broadly, but especially since you know Latin America so well, how are these countries that have many of the critical minerals that are going to be needed for this transition, more in Latin America than any other single place around the world, how are they thinking about this opportunity? What are sort of the, opportunities and pitfalls? How are they doing so far? How's the policy developing in some of these places?
Well, thank you very much, Shannon. It's great to be here at CGP and always congratulate Jason and all the fellows for the great work that they do. Let me just a little bit taking what Matt was saying in a different take. If you look at human history, new available technologies have always been accompanied by huge increases in energy consumption. Think about the steam engine and the massive uses of coal, for instance, or in the case of automobiles and when they entered and the huge consumption of gasoline. And now with AI and the cloud and everything that is coming with it is an immense and massive increase in the demand for energy and electricity consumption especially. As we have all heard in this conference, the energy transition is easier to talk about than to do. And it is especially hard for, let's call it the global south, as you suggest. You asked me to talk about Latin America. There is no region of the world better suited with the inputs for the energy transition. Over 65% of the lithium of the world, over 45% of the copper of the world, largely a clean energy matrix that is founded fundamentally in hydro, where 70% of the energy, especially in South America, comes from hydro. And then you have the challenges that you have today with El Niño, where you have huge problems of droughts, and every country is trying to wrestle through this. And the give and take is fundamental in understanding where these countries come from. There are things that they have been doing, some are correcting it, others are not, when it comes to fuel subsidies. Fuel subsidies don't make much sense unless you are directing them to public transport. But if I can afford a car, I should be able to pay a higher cost of gasoline. But since this is always a political price, it becomes very difficult. Some countries have begun to advance. The other aspect has to do with the financing of that transition. And, I remember being at the IDB, and for 10 years you would go to all these World Bank meetings and everybody's talking of the commitments that largely industrialized countries made of having at a minimum $100 billion a year for this financing, and we're still not there. And so there's got to be a give. Having said all that, Latin America and much of the global south missed the Industrial Revolution. It cannot miss this revolution. And the question is, how can you use energy as a way to attract ways to develop talent and really development through these new technologies? All of this happening in a time that the US and Europe have become more protectionist. And so these are the areas where you really need a serious conversation. A lot of this conversation is, what did the US do? What did Europe do? There's a lot of resources out there, but for the transition to happen, like you said at the beginning and with Matt, clearly there is a role for the private sector, but a lot is going to depend on how you use financing precisely to make it available to these countries. And there's going to have to be some give, because otherwise countries simply cannot do it alone. And this is where I think industrial policy plays a role. This is where all the hardware, let's call it, there is a space for countries to produce it. But more importantly, how can they jump in the new technologies?
Matt, let me just have you comment, perhaps, and just pick on Luis Alberto. We're all sitting here in New York City. Well, there are lots of finance ministers and others sitting in Washington right now at the World Bank and IMF meetings and the like. And, as you were saying, often the private sector isn't at the table at these discussions. If you were there instead of here and you were with AJ Bonga or some of these others, what is it that you would put on the table? Because financing the green transition is a big topic for this week. What's missing on that table today?
Partnerships. Public-private partnerships are at the top of my list. And that means earlier engagement, identifying those opportunities that may, as I said, already be financeable versus those that need enabling conditions and maybe need concessional capital. That's at the top of my list. I think prioritization is key. And I think what the World Bank and the IC are doing is amazing. But we need more scale, right? And the private capital that sits, in this room and elsewhere that is available for those opportunities, that's where the scale is. The other thing I'd like to kind of mention, I've talked to Ajay about this, is technology. And so when you think about the infrastructure that we, have inherited since World War II, it's largely very analog. It's single user derived, it's extractive, it's not circular, it's not smart. And if you think about energy transition and decarbonization, we will not get to any end goal by simply building on a linear basis. There's not enough time, there's not enough capacity, there's not enough land. Technology has to be deployed in a way that it never has before. And that's AI and machine learning, it's robotics, it's sensors, it's all of the things that enable everything from a smart grid to a more efficient, smarter waste reclamation process. And one of the things I would advocate to any government is think about how to bring more convergence together between what governments want and need and technology. Because you've got an incredibly brilliant venture capital industry in this country, but they don't have a lot of experience in infrastructure. And then you have an infrastructure, set of parties, both public and private, that don't have a lot of experience in technology. We have to bring that together because that technology is a huge difference maker in the future of achieving, something close to 1.5.
Or I have another question for you, if not.
Well, just briefly, I would just really agree with Matt. Having been to a lot of IPEF convenings, really a lot of what those countries are looking for to the United States is capital, is our financing and know-how and help on that. So I couldn't agree more that we're not going to get this done unless it's everybody in the room first time.
So let me ask this of all of you, and I'm going to start with you, Sarah. Yeah. We're talking a lot about policy, and policy obviously depends on politics. And this is the global year of politics. We have dozens and dozens of elections, and we have new governments in a good number of those countries. And so how important for, these kinds of things we're talking about, for outlaying of capital, for bringing and crowding in this investment, how important are some of these elections? And Sarah, I'm going to ask you about the one happening here in the United States. As you look forward, what are the big differences in the energy infrastructure landscape if it's a Biden 2 versus a Trump 2 administration that comes a year from now?
I think it's huge. I think, look, somebody mentioned this earlier in the day. There's lots of IRA projects that are in purple states and blue states and lots in red states. And so I'm not of the view that a second Trump administration would come and cancel the IRA, but there's a lot of implementation questions that very much impact deployment. Some of how you think about foreign entity of concern, and we could go on technical rule after technical rule that will really change the landscape, as well as some of what Podesta talked about, some of the environmental regulations that come with it. So again, don't think we're going to repeal some of the industrial policies and dollars we've seen put forward, but the curve here matters, and it matters a lot.
Matt, happy to have you chime in on that, on this election, on other elections, but When you're making investment decisions, how much does political risk play into it? I mean, how much is this influencing the kinds, because you're putting sunk assets in?
You know, it's a great question, and there was a time where when we thought about political risk, it was specifically confined to developing countries. And that's really no longer the case. And while I generally believe that we have reached a bit of a tipping point where the momentum around decarbonization, the cost of decarbonization is now, turned in our favor. So under either administration, I expect a continuation of policies that will promote, what we're all trying to achieve. I definitely agree with Sarah that it would be slower under a Trump administration than under a Biden administration. But my hope is that ultimately, when we see the shape of this country and we see the huge swaths of the middle of the country that benefited for generations from the industrialization of the United States, and now as technology has become a bigger driver of a service economy and a digital economy that's much more centered on the two coasts, can we not make the green transition the centerpiece of the resurgence and resurrection of much of the old industrial parts of the country? And I think that's what's happening with semis and fabs. I was out in Ohio recently. What's going on in Columbus is unbelievable, both in digital but also in wind and solar. So my hope is that regardless of the administration, I think this is something we should all press for, the opportunity set to promote these investments is really available in that big part of the country that is yearning for it.
Luis Alberto, when you look at elections, whether here or other places, how do you see it influencing this green transition? Are there particular places where it's on a knife edge? It might really matter.
No, I think something that Matt mentioned, I think is very central to this discussion, is the whole question of how can this transition help fast forward or accelerate countries embracing technology and being part of the technology change. You cannot continuously just export lithium or rare earths. I mean, we all know the tremendous drop in production of rare earths coming from China, and yet you have this huge abundance of rare earths in South America especially. And not to mention the kinds of things that can be done through technology in recirculating mining. I mean, there's a lot of things that you know well around this. But can you not use this moment, not only as a trade driver, but an industrial policy driver, to begin to incorporate a lot of these technologies in countries? You have the so-called SMRs, the small reactors, that is something that is starting in the US very early days. All of this should be, technologies embraced by others, because at the end of the day, this is the kind of transition that is got to be a global transition. If it's just in one part of the world, you will still have the huge effects on climate regardless. So we're all in the same boat. And how do we go about sharing that, I think, is politically the most difficult thing, but I think is the central thing.
So we have a couple questions from the audience, and they're both focused on AI. So I'm going to bring those together and ask those who want to comment on that. And I think the gist of both of them is, can AI make this easier, faster, better? So can AI help with efficiency in transmission markets? Can AI help with equitable solutions in the siting of projects or in better project design? How is AI going to influence this business? And Sarah, you're also now in the business side, so you might also have thoughts on this. But how is AI going to transform any of these either policies or actually the reactions that we're talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, without question. Everything from how you operate a grid most efficiently, how an individual consumer uses the electricity that they have available to them, whether it's in their vehicle or their home or elsewhere, how distributed energy resources are allocated, how waste is sorted. One of the biggest issues we have in the solar farms we own is these things at utility scale are so massive. How do you cut the grass that by the time you cut one side of the area, that's how big they are, the other side is already ready to be cut again. And it has implications for the performance of the panels. So robotics, as an example, sensors. I mean, it goes on, all in and around AI. I think it's absolutely, without question, one of the most important opportunities we have available to us.
Well, I am currently at Allen & Company. We spend a lot of time dealing with tech companies. And the one thing in talking to all the leaders in AI will tell you the following. The speed of the fall of costs of chips is far faster than what we saw with semiconductors in Moore's Law. And the binding constraint for the development of AI is going to be energy. And that is why all of these companies are looking for ways to lock in capacity to have far more access to energy to begin to move into the next cycle of 5 or 6 or chat, whatever comes next, because the language models will only get bigger as a result of incorporating data that is inside many companies, industries, etc. So how to go about that? Then you have the applications from the consumer-facing side, where you will be able to help people be far more efficient in how they consume energy, and then how you operate it, and everything in between, not to mention a huge portion of this, which is industry. I mean, the AI applications around the industry are still very early days, but just fundamental processes. So all of this should contribute to a world in which we can be doing far more with less, but notwithstanding, it will be with massive amounts of energy.
Just add one. The only thing I would add, I defer, but to absolutely agree. But as everything becomes more high tech and more AI, the national security things come into play in a bigger way, and we're already seeing that very much in the chips, space, where governments are trying to, draw which line is too high tech and which one is, not. And so I think it just becomes some of the, national security is going to feed in throughout this in more ways than it even does today.
I would just add that the other challenge of AI is that it uses a lot of energy to do its thing. And I was reading one study actually, and the way it was phrasing it is the only hope we have for humans to continue to have jobs is that we use less energy than large language models. So we will still have, we'll be more efficient in that sense. So this is a question, right? The energy that will drive the use of AI. So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to ask just one other sort of big question of you on sort of what I've heard today. We look out and there's this urgency and push to greening, the way we use energy and lowering our carbon emissions. And we still see, and we all know this, increasing demand for traditional fuels as we go forward. And already on the stage today, we have Mary Landrieu, who's like, this is an all of the above strategy. We need everything, which is probably true. But John Podesta laid out a very urgent. We need to push very quickly forward. We need to stop using fossil fuels. We need to lower the climate change costs. So how, as you think, just to, each of you a few minutes, as you think about this balance, do we need an all of the above strategy? Is it lean one way or another? And what should governments do to tip that scale or the ledger? Are they doing enough, and are there things they should be doing? So Sarah, should I start with you? And then we'll go down the row.
Look, I think it was said earlier today, I 100% agree. We certainly shouldn't be subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. So we shouldn't, have that kind of thing in place. I think the government should be doing everything to incentivize the transition towards cleaner fuels, towards these transitions. Things like the IRA, we've seen other governments do it. I think, Podesta's point is right. We are not decarbonizing as fast as we need to for this planet, and we should do everything we can to try and do that.
So we should put our finger on the ledger and really focus in on the green and much less on the other side. So not all of the above, or not equally all of the above would be your
Not
take.
equally all the above.
So I really do fundamentally believe that the current trajectory of humanity is not in our favor. And we have to become more circular and more regenerative, as a civilization if we're going to have longevity, certainly beyond my generation. That being said, I think that the approach today is entirely too supply driven, and that the suppliers are the ones that get, in my opinion, overly maligned. And we have to be acknowledging the importance of demand. Energy, along with healthcare and education, are the three things that really lift people out of poverty. And so demand is going to continue. Energy availability is something that drives, humans to have a better, standard of living. And so I'd say both. And one of the things which, my plug for what Jason is doing is everybody that is part of the potential solution needs to have a seat at the table. And I think all of the above, yes, we are going to need fossil fuels for a period of time. There's no question about that. But I also do believe that we should be promoting and investing and pushing alternatives to that. And one of the great things about humans is they can use technology to come up with incredibly innovative, cost-effective solutions. And I believe in that outcome.
30 seconds. You get to close us out.
No, I just think in following what my colleagues have just said, I would say it's hard, the energy transition. It's probably going to require more gas before we get to eliminate the dirtier fuels. And we need to be totally open about things like nuclear. And I know that this is a very complex debate, but I think Mary Landrieu said it very well. I mean, you got to have everything on the table, and you got to be working with what you have. The rest, I think we can go up on a cloud and say all the things that sound right, but I don't know that they're realistic.
Will surely be much more politics and policies in our future. But with that, thank you for the panelists, and thank you all.
Thank you.